But I want to start with the lackluster first voice to Parliament election in South Australia, where not even 10% of the Indigenous population voted. The government's touting this as a good starting point. The Premier's even gone so far as to say that it was a successful first election, which I think might be a little ambitious. One of the successful candidates, Scott Wilson, has blamed an overall lack of information as one reason there was such a low turnout. I mean, Joe, I know you supported the Voice to Parliament.
I did.
We were told that Indigenous people really wanted this, but in the first instance where Indigenous people have been given an opportunity to participate in a Voice to Parliament, not even 10% of people rocked up to vote.
Yeah, well, it was interesting. I mean, in the National Voice vote, it turned out Indigenous people did really want it, and especially in remote areas. All the booths in the NT, in the remote areas, in remote Indigenous communities voted in the order of 80% for it. So they did clearly want it. Part of the problem, ironically, is because that vote failed, a lot of the people, anecdotally anyway, there's people are saying for the South Australian Voice, thought, oh, this is actually just that thing that was run and lost last year. It's not actually on. There was confusion around that. There's probably, I think, justifiably a fair bit of confusion as to what a state-based voice could actually achieve and what will actually do. And I think, yes, often Indigenous voters or potential voters are very hard to target by virtue of the fact of where they live. But I think it's more about what this thing will do and how it will do it that will determine whether or not people decide they want to get involved and nominate and join it, or whether or not they just think it's just another talk fest. So if it is a genuine circuit breaker and comes up with genuine kind of real, sharp, hard-headed, community-focused ideas to tackle some of these really endemic problems, then I think people say, hey, finally someone's speaking my language, I want to be on this, or I want to decide who's on it. If it's just another talk fest complaining about colonisation or, you know, intersectional trauma or all the usual buzzwords that actually killed off the Voice last time around, then I think Indigenous people, like the rest of us, think, well, I've got better things to do.
That might be so, but surely you can... I mean, we're talking about 90% of the Indigenous population or thereabouts that didn't participate in this election, Evelyn. Like, it's not as though it was, you know, 50-50, obviously, in Australia, not in this case, but if you go to a state election or a federal election, voting is compulsory. Of course, in the US, voting is not compulsory, but you don't see only 10% of the population coming out to vote. So either they had no idea or they're just not interested.
I have another idea, actually. I'm going to throw a third option in the works here. You know, like, I don't understand why we're lamenting a lack of turnout after we ran a campaign that literally said to all Indigenous Australians that without a voice, you have no hope or no future in this country. Everything was banking on the voice. You've basically said the game's rigged, and then you've scratched your head and you're going, oh, why isn't anyone showing up to play? We've literally just told an entire nation of Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians that if the Voice doesn't get up, the entire system is against them. There's no hope. There's no future for them. The government hates you. The system hates you. It doesn't work anyway. So I feel like for such a long time, that's the message that was done. And then the referendum came around. The Voice didn't get up. And so you've got a whole group of people who obviously wanted to vote yes to the Voice, who are now left going, well, what does that mean for us? Our country doesn't want to hear our voice. Our country doesn't care. The game's rigged. So perhaps that played a certain role in why people didn't show up. Why would they show up if it's going to make no difference to their life anyway?
So in essence, you're suggesting that, you know, they think it's the white man's voice, essentially, which is what was said about the federal proposal, basically. I mean, you know, it was an idea that came out of, obviously, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. But if you look at all the people who have been involved in that, and probably the people who ultimately would have ended up on a national voice anyway, we probably weren't talking about people out in communities. And if you look at the nominations that were received for the South Australian Voice, I think they had in the vicinity of 140 nominations in the entire state. It's then broken up into something like 6 districts. Those districts will then have to each have their own little voices, and then those voices have got to come together and create some sort of statewide voice, and then they've got to go into state parliament and supposedly represent all of these districts with one voice to the state parliament. I just can't see how it's going to work. And to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of Indigenous people have reached the same conclusion, that you're not actually really going to achieve much here, because we don't all think the same way. That was the problem with the Voice in the first place.
Well, I think that was a big problem with the Voice. And you say white man's voice. I think the idea of the problem with the federal voice was that it was a city voice, not a Canberra voice, not a regional voice, which is where they really need help in those remote communities. And look how even this vote was conducted in the first place. There were candidates that one got as few as 6 votes and was successful because of the very low turnout. And only one got 178 votes. The rest of them that was successful got below 100 votes. And then, Caleb, they had this idea that there has to be gender balance in these 6 separate voices. So in one case, there was a man who had far fewer votes than a female candidate, and she lost out because they already had enough women. So how's that gender equity working out for you?
That is
not representative.
That's fantastic.
Don't you love
And
quoting?
once you start fiddling with electoral systems like that, you can do anything. I mean, it's harder to get elected to a country council, for heaven's sake. God almighty.